from the Psych Hub Podcast Network.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Burnout Antidote, infusing well-being into healthcare culture. I'm Paul Dager, joined by my all-time favorite co-host.
Hi everyone, this is Amy Perlman.
Hey Amy, I kind of grew up with storytelling. My sister is a professional storyteller, and I'd hope to think I picked up a few tips from her, but I think story is so powerful. So when I saw this as a topic, I was really excited that we have a chance to bring it in, because I don't know if we talk about this enough in healthcare, the power of story.
I love that. And I don't think I have a formal background in storytelling, but I think there's part of therapy that feels like storytelling on a regular basis.
Good point. Yeah.
I wanted to tie this in by start out just talking a little bit about narrative medicine, which I was excited to learn about.
Just the word gets me, excited, like, whoa, what's that?
Right. And I had more experience with narrative therapy in the behavioral health space.
Okay. Yeah.
But through these conversations and the research, really expanding this to think about narrative medicine in the healthcare field as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who are less familiar with narrative medicine, this is just the concept that how we tell our story affects the way we see the event.
Mm-hmm.
Three key principles that are tied to narrative medicine are attention, representation, and affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
And those really feel like kind of less of a feeling word to me and more of a descriptor. But this idea of how we tell our story, what parts do we pay attention to, who's represented in the story, what groups do they come from, and how does that bring in this unique understanding of who we are and how we perceive events in our lives. I think this is true for ourselves and for the people that we serve as well.
My mind is going 20 different directions right now as we go into this topic. And one is I've designed a number of assessment forms, both the old-fashioned pen and paper type, as well as for electronic health records. And how often in those we kind of get stuck in a task orientation and get stuck in sort of yes, no's. And recognizing that when we give someone space to tell the story, there's so much information there, and learning to let that be a place that we understand our patients from. There's always, there's a place for yes, no, certainly, but really finding one, how this can be better for the patient, but I also imagine as the clinician, listening to a story may help with that depersonalizing aspect of burnout. Like I really begin to tune into this human before me and the life path they took before they arrived in the treatment room or in the virtual session.
I appreciate that. I think this is the part of, I'm glad this is coming towards the end of our series because it feels like it brings in so much. It brings in an appreciation for me for all of the clinicians who have shared their stories with us along the way.
Good point. Yeah.
And it has also really highlighted the sense of common humanity. So Paul, I wanted to bring into our conversation today a program that I learned about at a conference I attended. And hoping that we can have a conversation with some of our friends from the Hear Me Now storytelling program and associated podcast. This is a part of the Institute for Human Caring at Providence.
Okay.
And we have two colleagues here to talk to us about it. One of them is Scott Acord, who is the communications manager at Hear Me Now storytelling program and associated podcast.
Okay.
And the other is Mike Drummond, who is the co-founder of Hear Me Now, both the storytelling program and the associated podcast, and the executive communications director for acute clinical care at Providence.
Cool.
Welcome.
Yeah, let's have a chat. Yeah.
Fun stuff.
Okay.
Just start out by saying hi to Mike and Scott. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good to have you here.
Yeah, it's a delight.
Could you guys tell us a little bit more about Hear Me Now and yourselves and how you got into this work and what you hope to do with it?
Scott, with your permission, I think I'll take the first step. Well, I'm a recovering journalist, and I got into healthcare about a couple of decades ago, motivated by the ethos of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. I was seeking something that would scratch that itch outside of journalism. I had done maybe one too many tours as a foreign war correspondent in Baghdad and Iraq. And I was looking around and I saw an opportunity for a communications job at something called the Institute for Human Caring at Providence, a large Catholic nonprofit health system covering 7 Western states on the West Coast here. And it was founded in 2014 by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ira Byock, a world-renowned palliative care physician, author, and all-around mensch. We're fellow travelers, and we quickly became friends and colleagues. And it was shortly after I joined the Institute in 2015 where we had hit upon the idea of using storytelling to help humanize healthcare, which was the thrust of the Institute for Human Caring. Basically, it would dust the tenets of palliative care across all of our service lines, and it would be a cultural change agent that would ask not only what's the matter with you, but what matters to you as a patient.
Wow.
And these would, I know, right? And these questions would be embedded into Epic, our electronic medical record. It would be embedded into our culture. We would be asking if you had an advanced directive just as easily and as fluently, literally fluently in a variety of languages, as we would ask you, if you were allergic to any medications, or what your blood type is. And as a component of this humanizing of healthcare, we looked around, and Ira was a board member, an advisory board member for StoryCorps, America's largest storytelling organization. And we wound up partnering initially with them to bring storytelling to one of America's largest healthcare systems. So storytelling has been shown to be effective, right, in many clinical settings.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It changed clinical and patient behaviors. A couple of examples are increasing empathy among medical students for those suffering dementia and Alzheimer's. And it also encouraged, storytelling has been proven to encourage patients to be immunized, which was a heated subject during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Here's the 411 on Hear Me Now. It's a storytelling program at Providence that records 40-minute conversations between 2 people, patients, loved ones, providers, or a combination thereof. These folks typically know each other, but not in all cases. And after that 40 minutes, participants get a digital copy, which is archived in the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress. So it's sort of a love letter to posterity.
So cool.
Right? And a copy goes to StoryCorps. So they get a copy. The American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress gets a copy. StoryCorps gets a copy. Of course, we get a copy. And we edit them down typically into 3 to 5 minute signature clips that we post on our website, often paired with images, photos, or what have you, kind of give it a Ken Burns kind of treatment. And that's what we've been doing since 2016. And we've amassed more than 600 digital recordings, kind of a close cousin to narrative medicine. It's the largest such collection of audio files from patients and physicians and caregivers of any health system in the nation. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's the largest such collection in the world of any healthcare system.
Congratulations. Very cool.
And it's all due to the team, Scott Acord, Melody Fawcett, and Sean Collins, Allison Jakes, and Michael Addis are, just to give name recognition to the team that makes all this really possible. I'm going to hand the conch over to Scott now.
So just a little bit about me. I spent my career in entertainment PR, working mostly in reality TV, and then began to feel burned out just because I felt like we were rewarding people for bad behavior. And I went looking for something that felt like entertainment, but had meaning and purpose. And somehow I stumbled upon an organization called Institute for Human Caring, and that they were looking for somebody to manage the storytelling program. And immediately I felt like I needed to have this job.
I'm wondering, before we get into sort of the impact of the program, my heart is feeling called to what's it like for you two to hear these stories? What, if you don't mind getting a little personal, you're hearing them firsthand. What's it like to hear these stories?
I have cried many, many times at this job. I'd never cried ever before at work. But sometimes hearing these stories, sometimes they're just beautiful and sweet and loving, and they'll make me teary-eyed. And sometimes they're heartbreaking, of love and loss. But they're real, and there's an honesty there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, amen, Scott, to that. I remember I did one with a woman who brought a baby to term knowing that it would live for maybe 4 minutes to 4 hours tops.
Wow.
And it was called Holding Abrielle, and Abrielle was the little girl. And it took a day or two to recover from stuff like that. I have a colleague whose husband received a heart transplant. There's a picture associated with that recording where the mother of the son who died is listening to her son's heart beating in the chest.
Wow.
Dude, I could barely express that without kind of getting choked up. And it's that kind of human connection that operationalizes the promise of humanizing healthcare. And when we can do that, I kind of kid when I can get Scott or anybody else to cry during one of these.
It's like an Oprah moment, or who's that other interviewer?
Yeah. But I think we feel, because of that intense human connection,
right?
The intimacy that recording in a sacred space allows. By the way, because
beautiful way to frame it. Yeah, thank you.
And it really ties into the things that we have discussed on other episodes of this podcast, which are really what brings us each that satisfaction. Scott, I loved your story of transitioning from burnout into feeling connected, and those ideas of feeling valued, and as if we are feeling connected, valued, and also, improving the system in some way. People come to work because they want to make things better. They want to make that connection. And we've talked a little bit about how we may change success from what that successful traditional outcomes of saving money or saving lives, and really transitioning that into what does it feel like in the process along the way for the clinicians, for families, and for patients.
Yeah. There's a part of our culture here at Providence that celebrates love. It's called leading with love. So we're not ashamed or red-faced to use the L word in a corporate setting. And I think, now I'm thinking about it here while you were talking, Amy, is that the emotion, that sacred space of the storytelling allows, is an expression of leading with love. One of the things that we teach our physicians and our clinical staff, that it's okay to love your patient platonically, of course. It's okay to love your patient, and it's okay to express emotion because we're human beings. So
it's echoing Patch Adams. I remember way back. The movie was, kind of fictionalized, but the spirit of him was this whole loving your patient in that way you speak to, as far as you care so much for their well-being. Yeah.
Here's an interesting anecdote. So not every story, right, is going to be rainbows and unicorns. We had one last year, I think, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong. It came from one of our ministries. We call our hospitals ministries in the Puget Sound area. And this recording was between two women of color, both doulas, and one was talking about her challenging, traumatic pregnancy experience, exacerbated by what she thought was systemic racism or racist treatment, right? And so we were alarmed by that, distressed by that. But we brought this recording to the head of OBGYN at this ministry. And rather than recoil and get defensive and tell us to go pound sand or whatever it is defensive people do, she had said, "Oh my gosh, thank you for bringing this to my attention. I think we want to use the Hear Me Now storytelling program to help with our cultural literacy curriculum." Wow. and help affect cultural change in this important department.
That sounds like an impressive leader who is willing to be vulnerable when, and confronted doesn't sound like the right word. There was a receiving that went on that allowed that to then take the next step. That was really powerful. Thank you.
This doctor is a highly evolved human being, and we need more people like her.
Yeah, no doubt.
And I think the bravery of the doula to tell her story as well, in a way that it could improve the system. I want to call that part out too.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Amy. This sense of to speak up can be scary.
Yep.
And so that bravery and courage, sounds like this program nurtures that for people to come forward. That container you spoke of, Mike.
Yeah. Well, since we're passing around accolades, it goes back to Scott for having the bravery to lean into this story. I mean, not everybody at Legal Risk and Compliance was thrilled.
Sure. I think.
Well, yeah, but speaking to that point, there's so much done in medicine and our systems around fear of what may happen that I think that's where the human gets dropped out. And so by this focus on not only human, because I hear it's a conversation, it's not just human, it's relational, that making a space where we can sort of bring that back to the core of what healing really is.
From your mouth, brother. So one of the founding precepts of the Institute for Human Caring was to make healthcare less transactional and more relational.
Yeah.
And not that we're ever going to take transaction out of the healthcare equation, but there's plenty of opportunity to infuse it with relational aspects.
And I think you're really pulling in some of these key words that we have been talking about all along the way with, we can't change that the healthcare system is profit-based several times, and how it is set up around productivity as a central factor. But how do you really integrate productivity with this sense of there are human beings here? And it's not a factory. It is not widgets. I don't want to be thought of as a widget, as a patient, as a mom, as a daughter, or as a clinician, because it is relational.
Yeah, Mike, it was funny when you were doing your initial description of the program. I'm a former EPIC trainer, and my ears just lit up when I heard that you are putting into EPIC relationship and humanizing, because I remember training nurses, doctors, allied health professionals, and it felt like we were dragging them into the training trailer and sticking them in front of this keyboard, and to infuse humanness back into our EHRs. Yes, I cannot celebrate that more.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
And
that's a good anecdote.
And in the middle of that too, I spent my morning looking at research, and you managed to mention this idea where EHRs and productivity are the things that healthcare clinicians feel like contribute to burnout, whereas humanity, connecting to patients and feeling valued by their employers, allowing themselves to be human beings versus human doings, that integration between real life and maybe it's the antidote to real life, or the antidote to burnout. I think that integration is what I would see as the future of having healthcare feel a little bit more human.
I appreciate that. And we're humbled to know that this isn't the magic wand, the universal solution, but it's a very important brick in the wall of bringing joy back to the profession.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm wondering, both Mike and Scott, one of the things we do in each episode is offer something back to our colleagues out there who are really working hard and need some guidance, some practices. And I'm wondering about, for both leaders that are listening right now, as well as floor staff and all the way in between, if they can't start up a full-blown program like you're doing, is there some elements of this that maybe can be introduced into any unit, any clinic, any department out there?
I think it doesn't cost anything to record. It's
True.
$0.
Yeah.
They can find ways to record. And there is, as Mike has said many, many times, authenticity is our currency, and it's true. They can take those stories and they don't have to edit them. They can leave them be, because that's where the money comes in. But I think that they can find ways to record. You can record on Zoom or Teams, or you can do it in person with recording equipment or your phone or what have you. So there are ways for people to create their own program.
So yeah, you can leverage the power of the audio note feature right in cell phones. You can record a conversation and put them up on a SharePoint site.
Okay.
You'd have a walled garden, right? You probably wouldn't want to post these publicly.
Right.
But you could have like a SharePoint site or whatever, kind of a community gardens where you could listen to your caregivers. Maybe you could like dedicate a program manager or project manager or an intern to maybe curate some of that.
This sounds pretty low lift, actually, because I was, I mean, everyone has the technology, and then just put a few simple guardrails around it to make it healing. And yeah, this sounds doable.
Yeah, totally. That's a bit of a DIY approach.
Ours is not that.
Yeah, ours is not.
Like, didn't want you guys to be putting yourselves out of a job or anything.
Right. Shh. Yeah, just between you and I.
I mean, I was hired to manage the program. And then there are a team of facilitators that all volunteer, led by Melody Fawcett, who she's a volunteer, and she has been so instrumental in informing and keeping this program alive, along with Mike, but she's a volunteer, and you can, tap into those who love this sort of thing within your organization to help out.
Yeah, so she's an employee of Providence, but she's a volunteer for the program because she's kind of a fellow traveler this way, like a storyteller. She's like an amateur archivist, but she's a certified patient experience professional. And she helps ground us that, hey, patients are the center of our gravity, and we should never lose sight of that.
Right. I'm wondering, so now that we're encouraging our listeners to go out and do this, based upon your experience, people that still may feel a little trepidation, because recognizing that, the healthcare system, sometimes vulnerability and authenticity is considered weakness. I'm curious how you encourage folks to step forward. Now you've got a program, people sound like they're lining up at your door, but how do you invite people to step through that trepidation?
Was it Mr. Rogers who said, find the helpers? You start with those who have a story to tell and want to tell it.
Got it. Okay.
And then you build out from there. So now we have a critical mass.
Okay.
600 plus and counting. So it's an easy proof point that we can show someone who may be hesitant to participate. But with a large enough system that we have, we no longer have a problem finding people to show up. We actually sometimes run into the problem of a backlog.
Okay. So it's the old build it and they will come approach, where in a large enough system, you're going to have folks who are the early ones to step in. Yeah,
true. But hope is always a bad marketing strategy. You need a good story to tell about your story. You need a good communication plan and, success metrics and, some discipline on that. But there is a tiny element of if you build it, they will come. Because if you don't build it, they'll never come.
And you also have to build in that sacred, safe space for them, and to
Okay.
make sure that it is honored at all costs.
Mhm.
Because people don't,
Mhm.
if they don't feel like they will be 100% safe, where some,
Right,
I
right.
always offer them, if they at any point want it private, we will make it private. Now, if it
Mm,
has appeared on the internet, there's only so much we can do, but we can make it
right,
private
right.
on StoryCorps. We can make it private in our files, so that they always know that if for any reason, we will honor their wishes.
The other thing that I've been thinking about is how you have really partnered to tell these stories together. And I wanted to know if you could speak to kind of two things. Is one, is there some value in telling your story on your own when people may not feel ready to tell their story in the presence of another? Or could you talk a
Mm,
little bit about the role of the listener as those
nice.
stories
Yeah.
unfurl? And I guess I'm thinking about that as maybe having one answer, but if it has two, answer it however you would like.
I think the role of the listener is to come into it with an open mind and an open heart. We can look at
Mm,
our OBGYN. She came into it with an open mind and an open heart, and she was receptive.
hmm
And it's causing change in the program, positive change. So there is that. And I think for others, one of the collections we did with Mission was faith and cultural tradition stories. And through that, these simple stories of somebody sharing their either religious or cultural traditions, like say Diwali or Ramadan or some of these other holidays that most of us who are, let's say, straight white Christian, the way we were raised, we don't know anything about them,
hmm
that those cultures. And so it opens our hearts and our minds as to why people react a certain way, or why they're celebrating this holiday. One of my favorite stories
hmm
we did is called Touch Becomes Sacred. And
Mm,
it's a home health care nurse, male. And he shares a story about why touch is sacred in his faith. He talked
mm,
about bandaging a woman after she had had breast cancer surgery. And after he was done, he says she did what any person in this culture tends to do. She wanted to give me a hug. And he had to say, I
mm.
don't hug. It's just part of my faith. And he began to talk about his faith a little bit. And we understood why touch was sacred to him. And that it's
Yeah,
separate from
yeah.
what he does in his job and something that is personal. And it was just such a beautiful story. And we learned so much in those 3.5, 4 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. So as a practical matter, so we have like 50 something volunteers. Some of them are caregivers, employees. Some of them are in the community. You call them listeners. We call them facilitators. I think I like listeners better. But we trained them on how to be active listeners. Maybe if a conversation comes to a cul-de-sac, how to, maybe there's a question prompt. There's also a way to step back and away from the story and don't interrupt. And just, it's sort of
hmm
an art and science. Some folks are better at it than others, but the good facility, a good listener and facilitator when at the end of 40 minutes the participants go, "What? 40 minutes already?" So
Yeah, and I'm hearing that stories like that create understanding, and my mind's going a little bit bigger, knowing that I hate to go political, but we know what's about to happen in the next 12 months. And if I can begin to listen and understand someone, even if I disagree with them, I'm less likely to see them as other. And that's when I'm hearing that the power of those stories, like you just mentioned, Scott, that we begin to understand each other. And how can that not lead us forward into a better place?
Yeah.
that's yeah. So we had an executive who did a Hear Me Now story. She's since moved to a competitor, but she talked about how she did the Camino of that walk in Spain, the kind of pilgrimage walk. And they were talking about how they were kind of clowning on the patchouli wearing hippie couple. And smash cut to 2 weeks later, they're best of friends. And
I love it.
I know. And at the end of that, I said, how could you hate someone once you come to know them? You know, once you know their story. And so I don't know, in these divisive times, getting to know your fellow human being is probably a value add rather than anything else, you know?
Well, and to bring it back into the healthcare environment, having caregivers and administrators get in the same room and understand each other, that the forces, the pressures that they're under in their separate spheres. There was another storytelling program, and I'm based on, it was done with, I think, high schoolers from people from different cultural backgrounds. They pair off and then they tell each other a story. Then they come back and they tell their partner's stories if it's their own. Mm-hmm. And I remember that really caught my ear, that if I feel so different from someone and now I present their story as my own, that really bridges the gap. And so, yeah, that's, what's the old up from the Oklahoma, why can't the cowboys and the ranchers be friends? Can we get the administrators and the frontline staff to find that bridge?
We've done a lot of conversation around dismantling the us and them, and we've been talking about it between kind of patients and practitioners, and we're all human beings. But in this case, I think it could be the storyteller and the listener, or the clinician and the administrator, or differing political or cultural views. It seems to really feel like it ties into this idea of a common humanity, or a lack of us and them being in it together.
And Amy, thank you so much for coming back to our theme has been the 3 parts of self-compassion. Yep. And so that, this whole conversation has been common humanity, hasn't it?
That's what I'm feeling here. So not just in the conversation, but with our colleagues here too. It's really nice to join with like-minded folks.
Scott and Mike, any closing thoughts that are rising up for you?
Well, obviously, thank you for inviting us here and having what I feel is like a very meaningful conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Right? I'm hoping that this conversation can add to a chorus of like conversations to where
I love it.
We're talking more about human connection. We're talking more about love for each other. And we're talking more about the many, 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 many things that we have in common rather than just a few things that divide us. So
beautiful.
That's my closing statement.
I just wanted to add that I've recorded hundreds and hundreds of these stories, and I've often heard or seen that from those who share their stories, there's healing in sharing, as well as the healing properties of being able to hear someone's story and understand them or the situation better. And so, I would recommend any company, especially healthcare, to find a way to incorporate storytelling.
I think we have found a closing theme with this entire series on, if with this podcast we raise a chorus across the country in healthcare systems, we have done good work. Yeah. So thank you, Mike. We may have to pay you royalties on that we raise a chorus.
No, please. It's gratis. I'll give to you.
Thank you.
Paul, that has to be one of my favorite components of our work together on this podcast was hearing the stories from Mike and Scott.
Yeah.
And the people that they've worked with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm so impressed with this hospital system that they put resources into this and recognized not only the value of story, but let's put some resources behind it.
I thought they did, and we did not prep them on this, guys, but they did a really great balance of the understanding of systems and individuals, which is something that is not always that easy to highlight.
Yeah, and I think we've seen, as we've gone through this, is this 16? Oh my goodness, it has been a journey, Amy, that we've seen the only way to address burnout and moral distress is to work both ends, the collective and the individuals. And so showing how story really does work the entire continuum.
And one of the things that really stood out for me in this interview is this idea of this is something that works for those who have a story. That was the criteria. And I started to think, who doesn't have a story?
Yeah.
And I start to feel like that's something that we can all relate to. And maybe we don't know how we want to tell our stories, or maybe we don't feel ready to share our stories yet. But we're always internally or externally pulling these stories together in terms of what our experiences have been.
Yeah, I think that begins to really honor the individual when you speak to the fact that you do have a story and maybe it isn't ready to be verbalized or shared. And we still want to honor the fact that you've lived a life worth sharing. And when you're ready to speak, we are ready to listen.
And I love that idea of readiness to listen, because I thought that brought in some of the systems level approach.
Yeah.
Of how much risk are we comfortable with as clinicians in sharing our stories. And I don't think this is a one size fits all answer.
Agree.
Some stories take more risk to share. And you always make me laugh when I refer to old supervisors. So maybe I'll call this one an old friend.
Okay.
But an old friend once told me that you have to not get tied to the outcome. And so the action of telling your story in a way where you don't need a specific reaction back is a level of readiness that feels different.
Well, this is feeling very therapy as far as this is a process focus, not a product focus. But I think that's worth noting. The telling is where the healing occurs.
I love that.
The other thing that comes to mind, again, coming back to the readiness, maybe the story just needs to be told for you to hear it. And maybe you do journaling, or maybe you just record it yourself and then go back. Like, the storytelling, to have someone bear witness is powerful. And for some of these higher risk stories, maybe another way to get it out is just record it yourself. And I think there's still power to that. So I want to give people a range of options in the storytelling. Sometimes there is an audience, and sometimes there's an audience of many, and sometimes an audience of one, which is you.
And I loved that Scott, I think, spoke to this too, in terms of how to make it safe to tell stories.
Yeah.
And part of that is, what does the healthcare culture look like? Who's listening to the stories? How do you tell your story in a way that other people will want to tell their stories? But then there was this other component of, sounds like the stories from Hear Me Now could go anywhere in terms of being in the congressional library, I think they said.
Yeah.
But also really having the choice of where is this housed, and acknowledging that if it is on the internet, it doesn't feel so private anymore. One of the things I really appreciated about the work we've done so far is giving people the anonymity in terms of sharing their stories with us at the beginning of each podcast. But also thinking about what are the things that each of us can do to listen, or what we could each ask for in terms of sharing our stories.
Well, Amy, I appreciate you recognizing when we initially came up with the idea for this podcast, and it was founded upon people sharing their stories. And to me, that's made, I think, all the difference in what you and I have discussed. And I've referenced this before, but also part of sharing a story is it's one link in a chain of conversations. And so by sharing your story, it's not an end unto itself, but hopefully invites other people to begin to ponder and begin to tie themselves into how do they relate to that. And we keep the conversation going. So for me, this podcast is, I almost feel like it's a wrap up the way I'm talking, but we have a few more folks. This is a success if you talk about it after it's over, if you bring it into your colleagues and you have conversations. Then I think, Amy, we've done some good work here.
I I appreciate that. And I hope that that is true in terms of doing the good work. I know it's changed me a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there was a certain intimidation factor of, can we live up to what we set out to do? And I think story has been key in this process of being able to create a healing opportunity for individuals and collectives and systems. So speaking of story, do you have more to say?
No, I was going to bring you into, what do you want to tell us about?
In researching for today, I came across a really cool variation on storytelling, which was being done, I think it was with high school students. And when I read this, I thought, this fits in so well to this episode. It takes storytelling to a new level. And so it's bringing together people from different populations. And when I thought about how to do this within hospital systems, one pairing was bringing together people delivering care and administrators. I think back to the movie Oklahoma, the musical, Why Can't the Cowboy and the Rancher Be Friends? And sometimes it feels like administrators and clinicians are being pitted against each other. So bringing together two different populations in the room, and then pairing off by the two different populations. And each of them tells a story around some kind of topic that's given. And one person tells the story, the other person listens, and then they swap. But then the second half of this process is everyone comes back together, and then you tell your partner's story from your first person narrative. And this is where we really begin to build the sense of stepping into someone else's shoes. And we build bridges across these wide chasms we have, and then, we're recording this, in 2023, and we know there's going to be a lot of division coming in 2024 due to a national election. Let's start building bridges across chasms now. And this is one way to do it.
I love that. I also really like the idea of hearing someone else tell your story, thinking about the parts that you may have left out, or the parts that you didn't leave out that did not resonate as much for them, but may have felt important to you. And that type of awareness of, one, how your story was heard and repeated can also do a lot of work on perception, I think.
Yeah. This may be my favorite offering we've done so far, because I have always felt like this has to be more than, I'm going to be redundant. This is more than a smoothie and yoga at lunchtime. And I'm hoping this one really engages the collective in a way that does begin to move the needle on moral distress.
Your smoothie and yoga is my walking and journaling. So I think they're the things that you just don't want people to tell you should do.
Yeah, nothing against smoothies and yoga, walking and journaling. They have a place, but they're not going to resolve moral distress.
I agree. And so as we wrap up today, I want to encourage people to take a look at Hear Me Now, and we'll include some of the stories that Scott and Mike referenced in our notes section. So take a listen. Can also check out their website or their podcast to learn more. And next week, what are we talking about, Paul?
We are going to go into a topic that I think needs some discussion, some light of day. It's substance use disorders and challenges that people have, and other addictions as healthcare clinicians. I'm looking forward to giving this topic its due, honoring this topic, and for all the different experiences people have out there with it.
Looking forward to the conversation.
Cool.
Thanks.
See you again next week. Bye, y'all.
Bye. If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It allows others to find us and to join along. The Burnout Antidote is executive produced and edited by Jacob Morrison. Research is assisted by Tekla Ross. Show artwork was created by Ornella Jangoli and Ashton Smith. A very special thanks to Juliana Castro, Alyssa Fackler, Trevin Stiegel, Andrea Womack, and of course, our pet, Pickles. The Burnout Antidote is a co-production from Psych Hub and is brought to you by Janssen Neuroscience.